It was a cold Tuesday morning when Alexander Reed, one of the most successful real estate magnates in the city, noticed something unusual. For the first time in 3 years, his maid, Clara Evans, didn't show up for work. Clara had always been punctual, almost to the minute. She arrived every day at exactly 7:30, wearing her faded blue uniform and that soft, humble smile that somehow made the mansion feel like a home. But that morning, her absence felt strange. Alexander didn't think much of it at first. People get sick, he told himself. But when she didn't answer his calls or messages, a quiet unease started to grow in him. Clara wasn't just another employee, she had become a quiet, constant presence in his empty life. She was respectful, discreet, and always caring. She never asked for anything, never complained about the long hours, never took a day off unless it was absolutely necessary. Alexander had always thought he knew everything about the people who worked for him. But in truth, he barely knew Clara beyond her work. He didn't know where she lived, what she did after work, or who she went home to. For a man who owned half the skyline of the city, he was surprisingly detached from the people who kept his life running smoothly. That realization gnawed at him. As the morning stretched into noon, he finally decided to go find out what was going on. He took his car keys, told his driver to take the day off, and drove himself, something he hadn't done in years. He typed Clara's address into the GPS, realizing it was a part of town he had never been to. The further he drove, the more unfamiliar everything became. The tall glass towers and polished streets faded into cracked roads and crumbling buildings. The air seemed heavier, and the faces of people walking by carried silent stories of struggle. It was a different world, a world Alexander had long forgotten existed. When he finally reached the small wooden house at the end of the street, he hesitated. The paint was peeling, and one of the windows was covered with an old blanket instead of curtains. It didn't look like a place where someone should have to live, especially someone who spent her days cleaning a mansion that could fit 20 of these homes inside it. He got out of his car and walked toward the door. He could hear faint noises from inside, a baby crying, and a woman's voice trying to soothe it. He knocked gently. For a moment, there was silence. Then the door opened just a crack, and Clara appeared, looking startled and pale. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, her eyes widening in disbelief. Alexander tried to smile. "You didn't come to work today. I wanted to make sure you're all right." Clara's lips trembled. "I'm sorry, sir. I meant to call you, but..." Her voice trailed off as the baby behind her cried again. Alexander's gaze shifted inside, and what he saw left him speechless. The house was dimly lit and almost bare, a small table, a few old chairs, and a crib made from what looked like old wooden planks. A little girl, maybe 7 or 8, sat quietly in the corner, hugging a worn-out doll. Her big brown eyes watched him curiously, yet warily. Clara followed his gaze and stepped aside nervously. "Please, come in, sir." He hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath his polished shoes, and the faint smell of soup filled the air. He noticed the walls were cracked, and there was a small heater struggling to keep the cold away. The baby's crying grew louder, and Clara quickly picked him up, rocking him gently. Alexander spoke quietly. "I didn't know you had children." Clara looked embarrassed. "I never mentioned them. I didn't want to lose my job. It's hard to find work when employers know you have kids, especially a baby." Her words hit him like a quiet storm. "Lose your job?" "Clara, I would never." "I know, sir," she interrupted gently, "but I couldn't take that chance. I've already lost too much." Alexander watched her as she tried to calm the baby, her hands trembling slightly. There was exhaustion in her eyes, not just from sleepless nights, but from years of carrying burdens alone. He looked around again, noticing the small framed photo on the shelf. It was of Clara with a man in a military uniform. "Your husband?" he asked softly. She nodded, her eyes misting over. "He was. He died 2 years ago in an accident. Since then, it's been just me and the kids." The baby stopped crying for a moment, as if listening. The little girl came closer, holding her doll tightly. "Is this your boss, Mama?" she asked shyly. Clara gave a faint smile. "Yes, sweetheart. This is Mr. Reed." The girl looked at him with innocent eyes. "Thank you for letting Mama work for you. She says you're kind." Something in Alexander's chest tightened. Kind. He had never thought of himself that way. He was efficient, focused, demanding, but kind. He had spent years building his empire, never stopping to think about the people who worked behind the scenes of his success. And here he was, standing in the home of one of those people, seeing the reality they lived in. He looked back at Clara. "Why didn't you tell me you were struggling like this?" She shook her head quickly. "I didn't want pity, sir. I just wanted to work. To earn honestly. I didn't want you to think I was asking for help." Alexander's throat felt dry. He glanced at the small pot simmering on the stove, a thin soup that barely looked enough for one person, let alone three. The fridge was old, and when Clara opened it to fetch some water, he noticed it was almost empty. "Clara," he said quietly, "how long have you been living like this?" She smiled faintly, a kind of tired grace in her voice. "Long enough to stop counting. But it's okay. We have each other. That's more than enough." He couldn't speak for a moment. The man who had everything, wealth, luxury, reputation, suddenly felt small in front of this woman who had nothing, yet still carried a strength he couldn't understand. He took a deep breath. "You shouldn't be living like this. You and your children deserve better." She looked up, startled. "Please, sir, I'm not asking for charity, I know," he said gently. "But I'm not offering charity. I'm offering respect. You've worked for me for years without ever asking for a thing. The least I can do is make sure you and your children are safe." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he replied softly. "Let me help." For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then she nodded, silently, as if the weight she had carried for years had finally cracked just a little. Alexander spent the rest of the afternoon helping her fix things around the house. He called his driver to bring groceries, blankets, and some basic furniture. The little girl watched with amazement as boxes arrived, her face lighting up for the first time that day. When Alexander handed her a new doll, she hugged it tightly and said, "Thank you, sir. Now my doll won't be lonely anymore." That night, as he drove back home, Alexander couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. The image of Clara's humble smile, her daughter's innocent eyes, and that cold, empty house haunted him. He realized that behind every person who worked for him, every maid, driver, gardener, there were stories like Clara's. Stories he had never cared to know. When he reached his mansion, the marble floors and grand chandeliers suddenly felt meaningless. He sat in silence for a long time, then picked up his phone and made a decision that would change not just Clara's life, but the lives of everyone who worked for him. He would start something new, a foundation to support single parents who worked for his company. It would provide housing, childcare, and education, not as charity, but as a way to give back the humanity he had forgotten. As he looked out the window, the city lights shimmered below like a sea of stars. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, not pride, not power, but peace. He finally understood that wealth meant nothing if it couldn't heal the hearts of those around you. And somewhere across town, in a small wooden house now glowing with warmth, Clara held her children close and whispered a silent prayer of gratitude, not for the help she had received, but for the kindness she had inspired.